Howdy, y'all. My name's Laura Womack, and I decided to do this presentation on the autoimmune disorder celiac disease. Celiac disease, usually spelled and spoken celiac disease in the United States, and sometimes referred to as celiac spruce or gluten-sensitive enteropathy, is an autoimmune disorder that generates a hypersensitivity to the protein gliadin, which is found in gluten. This hypersensitivity reaction occurs in the small intestine, which, as I'll explain later, can be a pretty big issue. Untreated celiac disease can cause a potentially fatal malabsorption of nutrients into the body. It can also lead to the development of additional autoimmune disorders such as type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis. The reason that celiac disease is such a big deal is because the small intestine is critical for nutrient absorption into the body. This is because the way that it's designed allows for the maximum amount of surface area in the initial organ that actually begins to process and absorb nutrients into the body rather than just break down the food you've eaten. As you can see here, this is what the villi of a normal gut would look like. These villi serve the purpose of increasing the surface area in the small intestine, and you can see on this illustration that the villi themselves have microvilli, which just further increase the surface area and therefore the amount of nutrients that the small intestine is capable of absorbing. In a normal, healthy person, all is well and fine. The microvilli and villi do their job and life goes on as normal. But for a person with celiac disease, over time, the immune response generated due to the absorption, or rather lack of absorption, and breakdown of the protein gliadin causes the epithelial cells that line these villi to break off and die. Now, before we continue, I think it's really interesting to talk about the historical perspective around celiac disease. So, archaeologists in 2008 found human remains at a dig in Italy that dated back to the 1st century AD that exhibited like intestinal damage consistent with what one would expect from a person who suffered from celiac disease. And then when the remains were tested, they actually showed the presence of the celiac HLA-DQ 2.5 gene, which is just incredibly interesting to think that this disease that affects granted a small portion of the population, but in such like a all-encompassing way has been around for that long. But then in roughly 50 AD, we have the writings of a Greek doctor philosopher, Artaeus of Cappadocia, who writes what we consider to be the first medical description of celiac disease, which he referred to as the Coeliac affliction. He named the disease Coeliacos after the Greek word kolia, meaning abdomen, which seems pretty spot on, honestly. Then in 1887 into 1888, Dr. Samuel Gee wrote what is considered the first modern specifically medical description of celiac disease, and hypothesizes that it could be treated through diet. Throughout his career, he tried many different types of diets to treat people with celiac disease, but was unable to pinpoint what specific food triggered the disease. And then in 1924, an American pediatrician by the name of Dr. Cindy Haas treated children with celiac disease with a banana diet that was incredibly effective, as one might imagine, because bananas don't contain the protein gliadin found in gluten. I don't think I said that protein right. It's gliadin. Gliadin, I think, is the correct pronunciation for that. protein. Um, and Dr. Haas's treatment was wildly successful, and he became instantly popular with families that had celiac children because they seemed to be cured briefly. But as soon as they stopped displaying symptoms because their small intestines had healed, their families would put them back on a normal diet that included the protein that was harming them. And it just was a vicious cycle that eventually led to the same um, end results that you would see in someone with celiac disease who hadn't ever attempted to treat it. And then in the 40s, Dr. Wilhelm Deik theorized that wheat is what triggers celiac disease and developed a wheat-free diet to treat celiac patients. This is really interesting because he made the connection during World War II because of a famine caused by the war, the Dutch famine. Because of that famine, bread became entirely unavailable in the town that he lived and worked in. And during that period of time, the number of coeliac disease related deaths that he observed at the hospital he worked at decreased to 0. It's just really interesting to think how outside of the historical context, some of these connections might not have been made. And then in 1952, an English medical team published findings that about wheat and rye flour in relation to celiac disease that just further supported Dr. Deik's theories. In 1956, a Dr. Margot Scheiner performed the first oral biopsy on a child with celiac disease, and in doing so, developed a new technique for diagnosing celiac disease that was instrumental in accurately diagnosing the disease and other GI disorders at the time. In 1964, the anti-gliadin antibody was discovered. That antibody is what that antibody and others are what doctors test for to diagnose celiac in blood work. In the 1980s, the connection between celiac disease and autoimmune diseases, such as type 1 diabetes, as I mentioned earlier, became well accepted within the medical community. And then in the 90s, celiac disease was accepted as its own autoimmune disease with a specific gene, that gene being the HLA-DQ gene, or alternatively, the HLA-DQ2 or DQ8 genes are the specific genes that are associated with celiac disease. And then in 1997, the role of the antigen tissue transglutaminase, TTG, in celiac disease is discovered. And that role is that TTG is an enzyme that, when it comes in contact with the protein gliadin, just further damages and weakens cells. So there are actually hundreds of symptoms of celiac disease, which makes the signs and that the signs and symptoms of celiac disease are non-specific, making it extremely difficult to diagnose. And since celiac disease can develop at any age upon exposure to gluten, and we don't know exactly what triggers that immune response to activate that initial time, the wide variety of symptoms that children to adults can experience means that diagnosis happens on average 6 to 10 years after a person begins to experience symptoms related to the disease. And here I have a really long list of symptoms, so I'm just going to go through them rapid fire. For adults, you see unexplained iron deficiency, which is just anemia. You see fatigue, bone and joint pain, arthritis, osteoporosis, which is bone loss and failing, liver and biliary tract disorders, depression and anxiety, peripheral neuropathy, which, um, as you can see here, is just tingling, numbness, or pain in the hands and feet. They also experience seizures and migraines, missed menstrual periods. They have an increased risk of infertility or recurrent miscarriages. They experience canker sores inside the mouth, and also this rash that doesn't form in every case, but is very characteristic when it does form, as it's very specific to not to celiac disease, in and of itself, but it's specific in that the two are considered um, comorbid. It's dermatitis herp. I'm sorry, I can't quite see that. Herpetiformid, herpetiformis. Excuse me, I still can't quite get the pronunciation of that. Um, and then in children, you see abdominal bloating, chronic diarrhea, vomiting, constipation, pale, foul-smelling or fatty stool. Again, anemia, unusual weight loss, fatigue, irritability, and behavioral issues. You experience dental enamel defects. So if your child's experiencing cavities at a rate higher than normal than you would expect in a child that age, um, you experience delayed growth in puberty due to that lack of nutrients that the child is experiencing. And by extension, you also see short stature in those children. All of this we consider to be a failure to thrive in a child. Um, Additionally, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is also a really common comorbidity in children and adults who also have celiac disease. In the United States, an estimated 1 in 133 Americans, or roughly 1% of the population, actually has celiac disease. And celiac disease can affect men and women of all races and ages. We haven't discovered any specific population that's more likely to suffer from celiac disease than another. However, up to 83% of Americans who have celiac disease are either undiagnosed or misdiagnosed with other conditions because, as I mentioned in the last set of slides, a lot of the signs and symptoms of celiac disease are nonspecific. Worldwide, those statistics roughly hold. The worldwide prevalence of celiac disease is 1.4%, and that's based on blood tests. And based on biopsy results, it's roughly 0.7%. And again, globally, the prevalence of celiac disease varies uh, with age, sex, and location of the population being tested. Um, so a great diagnostic, there are two main diagnostic methods for celiac disease, which is serology testing, which tests for the presence of several different types of antibodies that would indicate whether or not an immune response to the gluten protein is happening or not. The two main antibodies that are tested for are the antibody related directly to the gliadin protein and the antibody that you see in addition to the TTG enzyme. Um, Another option is genetic testing. You can test for the leukocyte antigens associated with HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8, which will basically rule out celiac disease and allow your doctor to attempt to find another explanation for your symptoms. However, before you get a diagnosis, it's really important that you don't attempt to self-treat because that can impact the way that the tests come out. This is because the only real treatment for celiac disease is a strict gluten-free diet. And if you begin that diet before you get tested, it will throw off the results. And with that, I think I've said about all I can say. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, just email me or visit the Celiac Disease Foundation website. And here are my sources. Y'all have a great day. Bye.